Dear people of God, welcome to Reflection on Introduction to the Devout Life. In the previous chapter, we reflected along with the Reverend Father Dennis Lemos on self-purification. We shall continue our journey with St. Francis de Sales and our devoted life. Devotion for St. Francis de Sales is to be devoted to God in everything, detaching ourselves from the worldly life, desires and possessions that might take us completely away from God and His love. In his attempt to instruct the people of his time, and of course, we cannot negate the fact that this masterpiece is very much prevalent to this day, gives a step-by-step instruction so as how we can be fully and clearly devoted to God. In and through the forthcoming chapters, I invite you to reflect along with me on the words of St. Francis de Sales, which will be of great assistance to our devoted life. In this chapter, St. Francis de Sales instructs the way of purifying ourselves, that is, to purify ourselves from mortal sin. I have attempted to present to you this chapter in 5 parts. First of all, to begin with, let us ask ourselves, what is purification? In a simple term, it is to clean oneself. We say that the house is clean only when we have completely removed dust from every corner of the house and from every article that are there in the house. Once it is cleaned, the house looks brighter than before. Similarly, to purifying our soul involves a thorough cleaning of ourselves. It is to cut off oneself from old self that was imprisoned by worldly pleasures and desires, which were of utter immaterial to our spiritual life, and to be clothed with a new self that will be given by the Holy Spirit. Secondly, purification also would mean to give up the past that was bitter and to embrace the present, which is new and sweeter like honey that adds taste to the life. Remember, a tasteless life is as good as not having one. And thirdly, purification means to die to sin and rise to new life. Thus, purifying oneself from mortal sin is to be born again and to rise with Him in glory, to be members in His new home, as said in Romans chapter 6 verse 4. And so, a common means of purifying ourselves that has been taught by the Church is by the way of sacrament of confession. Secondly, let us now see how to prepare for confession according to St. Francis de Sales. St. Francis de Sales gives us a method of making a meaningful confession which will help us to purify ourselves from mortal sin. He gives a 2-step guideline to make a good confession. The first one, to choose a confessor who will also guide us how to prepare for a good confession and help us to grow spiritually. And secondly, to choose a guide or a booklet which has been officially prescribed by the Church to prepare for the sacrament of confession. Through one of these means, we first of all come to know ourselves, that is to say, who we are, what we are, and all our dispositions. Secondly, after having known ourselves, we need to gather up all our sinful dispositions, which till that moment was of utmost importance in our life and hindered our love for God. And thirdly, we need to have a convinced decision to detest each of the sinful dispositions and to renounce them completely in our lives with contrition and regret. This way of preparation for confession is strongly recommended by this great saint and believes that this will help a person to grow spiritually and move towards God more closely. Thirdly, after having seen how to purify ourselves from mortal sin through the sacrament of penance, let us now move towards the next part of our reflection. What happens when we sin? Oftentimes, the topic sin has been covered so well in our retreats. But now, I am going to reflect with you what St. Francis de Sales says about sin and its effects. St. Francis says, when we sin, we lose God's grace that has been poured into our hearts by baptism. And so, as a result, we give up our place in heaven that has been prepared for us. As we read in John chapter 14, verse 3, I am going to prepare a place for you in heaven, that I may come back and take you to be with me, that you also be where I am. He continues, by sinning, we take up upon ourselves the everlasting suffering of hell, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, as we read in Luke chapter 13, verse 28. And lastly, when we sin, we renounce God's everlasting love, as in the words of St. Paul in his second letter to Thessalonians, chapter 1, verse 9. These will pay the penalty of eternal destruction, away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. And so, St. Francis de Sales, after having cautioned us about the impact of sin that will be upon us, gives us a solution of confession. This time, he does not speak about the usual confession that we all make, but he speaks about the general confession. As for him, general confession is not always necessary, but it is necessary to use it at the beginning of the purification, as we look forward to be clothed with new soul. In the next part, some might ask, why is general confession required or recommended? When we speak of general confession, the first thought that might arise in our mind is, what is the need for general confession when we have our usual confession? St. Francis gives us three answers. The first one, in the usual confession, we make less or no preparation. That is because it is our routine way of making. Therefore, it has no or less impact in our lives and to our behavior. Secondly, in the usual confession, the time to make sufficient contrition is seldom seen. Hence, it becomes ineffective. And thirdly, a lack of conviction to avoid sin and a strong determination to return to sin becomes more vivid in the usual confession that is made without sufficient contrition. If we want to avoid sin, we need to first of all avoid the occasions of sin. About this, we shall see in the coming chapters in an elaborate way. Therefore, St. Francis de Sales says that general confession reminds us and helps us in gaining confidence to avoid sin and occasions of sin. And that is our final part of the reflection. That is, what does general confession do in our life? General confession invites us to a forgotten knowledge of ourselves and arouses us to a healthy embarrassment for our past life, so that we develop a hatred feeling towards sin and its occasions. It makes us marvel at the mercy of God, and He is waiting for us with patience, as we see in the case of the prodigal son, and brings peace to our heart as it brought in the life of Zacchaeus. General confession refreshes our mind and rejuvenates us in His love and urges us to good resolutions, that we continue to remain in His mercy and love. And ultimately, it opens our heart to express ourselves with confidence in the forthcoming confessions. Thus, after having reflected upon our purification from mortal sin, we shall conclude our reflection on this chapter with this thought. Renewal of spirit with complete conversion to God is a clear sign of committing oneself to the devout life. May God bless you. Live Jesus.